workshop environment, the conversations. I think of my work as a kind of in the sort of quilting bee or barn raising metaphor, where people can come together to create something, but often it's in service of a much needed conversation. I just want to mention briefly a project that I did that also was trying to expand craft, where I traveled throughout England and the US working with very self-identified traditional craftspeople, learning things like blacksmithing and lace making, linen weaving, felt making, spinning, dyeing, horn carving, wood carving, and many, many other different kinds of traditional crafts, because I really wanted to understand the impulse for a kind of preservationist making, almost like trying to understand that what you could think of as almost the most conservative kind of making. It's about conserving history. It's about preserving a craft form in amber at a particular moment, and I had a lot of questions about that. So this was a project that was exploring kind of the politics of craft and economies of the handmade. It was tracing the seeds of the arts and crafts movement. And so in this sculpture, which again, it starts with a toy, it starts with something functional and accessible, it's actually the result of conversation. So every object that you see in this peddler's basket was the result of an exchange with a maker that came with a conversation about what could be considered revolutionary within traditional craft practice. It's a project like the Muster that has a lot of stories to it that can never quite be told in a forum like this. But this was a Phrygian cap that I made with a hat maker in London. Just to give you an example of some of the objects, this was a convalescent soldier pincushion that had been made in World War I that I recreated. One of my favorite objects in this whole project was made by an Bay Area artist named Aaron Toole, who is a Gulf War veteran, a Marine veteran, and he has a really beautiful practice of making these cups and giving them away, and using that as a vehicle for starting conversations about war, essentially. This is from a series where he actually shot the cups with a gun. This is cool here. At each of the locations of that project, I tried to use the museum or the gallery as a meeting and making space to draw in people to the ideas that were raised by the project, for conversation, for demonstration, a new kind of demonstration of skills, a new kind of political demonstration through craft and through skills exchange. This is a cup that Aaron made that actually has an image of my hobby horse, so that there's a way in which a lot of these projects move back in themselves. I think I'm at 24 minutes, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead. This was a project that I did at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. This is a large patchwork quilt that's based on quilts made during around the time of the invention of the kaleidoscope. It's based on a quilt that very innovatively took the pattern to the edges of the quilt, almost like shock waves that couldn't be contained. And I was interested in treating this quilt as a backdrop for a conversation. I had gathered a lot of local makers to create the quilt itself, but then it served as the backdrop for a kind of psychedelic light show of sorts. Facing the quilt was this large colonial wall sconce, which is like an inverted disco ball meets satellite dish. When you approach the sconce, you see yourself reflected, as well as this pattern in the background. And I was really interested in the idea of the light show as something that is both about escape and consciousness raising at the same time. I did a lot of programming in the space to activate that kind of space between the quilt and the sconce, with everything from scholars on psychedelic light shows to Cleve Jones, one of the founders of the Names Project, AIDS Quilt, a lot of different activities in the space. And this was also the beginning of sort of the launching of a project that I've been doing that's ongoing, which is a restaging of a World War II program that was here in the Bay Area called the Arts and Skills Service, which enlisted hundreds of artists and craftspeople to engage in the healing process with returning veterans through teaching art and craft skills. And this project has been traveling, starting at SF MoMA and then to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, which you see here, where the scraps of the quilts were used to create a braided rug that became a platform for reflection and dialogue on this notion of wartime craft. Brody mentioned the storefront project that I do, and a lot of the workshops that have taken place there are engaging folks together in a dialogue around these issues. So my work has really followed this kind of arc from starting with this notion that people, everyday non-soldier or veterans, everyday people wanting to reenact a historic battle, to enact a kind of trauma, whether on a cultural level or a personal level, all the way across to this current work that is, using craft as a way to create dialogue or a way to kind of encourage a sort of healing process that I think is not only important for veterans, but for civilians, like for all of us who are feeling that sense of dread and anxiety and frustration and pain from, the actions of our own government. Anyway, I should wrap this up, but trench art is a theme, art that's been made by soldiers in wartime, so a lot of the workshops have been around that. And then finally, this was an event at the former location of SF MoMA, which was the Veterans War Memorial Building, the one that was mentioned earlier today. That used to be where the art museum was, in the War Memorial. So that seemed like a good opportunity for me to kind of focus in on what that relationship could be. So I'm going to stop there, but.
Improvisation responded. I just want to say that I've sort of been raised in the academy, and I want to constantly find ways to undo that structure and to have a more inclusive opportunity in the last 10 or 15 minutes that we have. But I just want to thank Shannon and her whole team here at ARC, who are trying to put together that dinner party with odd dinner guests that cross sectors from the academy to the community to the social workers, and try to bring them around a table to have a conversation. I just want to say I really appreciate that effort. I know that we're always, as somebody said earlier, organizers are always looking at who's not in the room, and we always have to be mindful of that. But I just want to say this is kind of a marvelous moment to be able to be in conversation with all of you. So I want to make sure it's not just me responding, but that we're in conversation. I just want to say, so aside from the odd dinner guest metaphor, I do want to go to the Astor's sort of reconciling or unreconciling the past. And I think I have a lot of strong feelings being in the academy of to what point do we honor the past or allow it to remain our precedent, or do we unreconcile or repurpose the past? And I think that the artists here have really speak for themselves in terms of how they kind of use that past as a kind of materiality in which to repurpose the present. I think what the Astor said, instead of abandoning his practice of clay, he carried it forward. He carried the Black church forward into the world that he was residing in. Or Bill Mack's The Reenactment Soldier is being carried forward into the moment. Along with the building this morning, the intersection for the arts, having to reconcile a past in one building and now being moved into another space, and to what degree do we carry forward that past? And of course, I mean, I am the product, and I have to say, I always speak from this position of being, basically grew up and grew old in the academy. I got a tenure teaching job when I was just out of graduate school in the good old days of the late 80s, and I think having stayed in the system, I realized to what degree the world has changed and that system doesn't. So I guess in many ways, I really want to go back to the sort of pedagogy, and that's, you know, we are in a pedagogical institution, of in what ways we teach artists and we pass on these traditions and conventions and structures of art. And so in terms of the expanded field, I think here are two incredible examples or pedagogical models that I would love my university to move toward, which is kind of a fantasy. But indeed, they are learning models, they are teaching models. And so I just want to say that I aspire as an entrenched academic who runs an institute, who's, you know, basically I call myself an activist with tenure, trying to do this kind of work within this institution. I just want to say you remain the models that I so admire. So I just want to say that and then like open it up. I think there are people with a lot of questions. And I do want to have one question, which is, you know, transformation. You know, in what ways, like I always think of the Extreme Makeover house and wanting to go back a year later and sort of know what came of that whole cathartic experience a year later. Is the house in order? Did the lives change? And so maybe you both could address, like, you know, what happened to this reenactment soldier? Do you have some sense of how, for example, the Kohler workers or the institutional Milwaukee Museum maybe changed the way in which they did their work as a result of their work? So I'll leave it with that question, and then, you know, open it up.
Yeah. Well, I'll first respond to just one of the things you said, which is, you know, we also work in institutions that move slower than maybe our art practices. And maybe in some ways, our art practices get to be responses to a different pace that is required, so that in the same day, there are multiple modalities and different speeds at which we operate. You know, and what feels really great is that that there's room inside and outside of institutions to ask questions about all of the things that are not being talked about. And you know, so often I feel like corporations get the pleasure of deciding what's missing in a place, and capitalists or entrepreneurs are the ones who kind of say, oh my gosh, if we would just use the bottom of tires for shoe treads, that might be very interesting. And I'm always thinking, like, maybe there's another kind of space that artists could begin to occupy that is in that zone of kind of imagining where the moments are in culture that are missing, and choosing with no grant money, with no, to just kind of insert themselves in that cultural moment. It's a charge that I've given myself, a charge that I've given myself. Your other question though about what happens later, I think one of the things that I've found is that when you go to a place and you do a big project, it's hard to leave. And if you're not careful, you can do more damage than you do good. Maybe it's better that you didn't come. And so if you're gonna do projects that engage people, you gotta have like a pretty solid and sexy exit plan. Or you gotta stay. And so one of the things I've found is that, you know, I'm not really good at exiting, you know, and so I've essentially accumulated a set of cities that I work in ongoing. And so the work doesn't end. It just kind of started with one museum project, and now we don't need the museum anymore. Now I have friends, and so Chicago, St. Louis, and Omaha are places where I kind of just get train tickets and, you know, hop around. And,
yeah, there's a phrase I heard in the context of working with veterans called drive-by caring, you know, and of course, I mean, I think that when I was in graduate school, this idea of plop art and, you know, artists sort of jetting in, this was just like the public sculpture model of artists jetting in and plopping down their sculpture and then leaving. And so I think I'm sort of somewhere on this trajectory trying to move toward a place where I can understand what this is, you know, what my role is. And I feel like I've started projects and I've gotten to points where I know that they could go actually much, much further. And so in many ways I feel like I'm only just at the beginning, and I'm trying to answer that question. That is the biggest question, and I totally relate to what you were saying, and we've talked a little bit about this before too. It's like, but at the end of the day, is this really the thing? Is art really the thing? Is teaching really the thing? Is, you know, how do we use the money that comes in the way that it would have the most impact? You know, what are the areas that are sort of, you know, the most urgent or important, and what are the ones that I feel I can sustain for myself, and where do I want to be? Is that here? Do I put roots down here? Do I keep going? Do I, you know, all those questions are so unresolved for me, and I completely recognize the need for that kind of, you know, immersive, ongoing relationship, and I think in a lot of ways I have that, but that definitely people sort of fade into the distance and then they come back, and then it's all very kind of overlaid.
I think of the practice of Rick Lowe and Project Row House and his, you know, long-standing commitment to a place, which I find remarkable, right? Someone, you know, young, actually committing to this community that he was part of. And, you know, that is always a question of, and then the Creative Time, this year's award winner, Jenna Von Heist, yeah, you know, spending 3 or 4 years in a place. And I mean, I think you present an interesting mobility model, which is, you know, being able to actually check in, pass through, invest over time in a very different way.
Well,
Which I find interesting.
yeah, maybe in the same way that I think Allison was making the point that the practice isn't necessarily about material commitment, but a set of beliefs that you believe in, and then you carry those through any number of things that I think that I've decided that poor Black places, or the abandoned, forgotten parts of the city, are the parts of the city that are really important to me. And that in some ways that's rooted in Chicago, but in some ways it's rooted in the problem of, like, how does a city forget about a part of itself?
Yeah.
And then what could I do with these tools, this disciplinary background in planning? How can I help cities reimagine reattaching itself? And some of that has to do with silly things like getting the wealth of the city to visit a part of the city and say something about it in a newspaper article. How do you begin to challenge stigma, right? And so you have to fight bad, you know, the stigmas that have been created. You got to fight those with these things. And sometimes objects aren't the tools necessary to do that. You need some hype. And so how do you identify the right tool to change the perception of a place? And so those become the problems that I have. Not like, how do I fill a 1,500 square foot space, but how do we get people to reimagine North St. Louis or North Omaha? And those become more interesting problems, I think, for me, or a better use of my time. And then objects become byproducts of trying to solve some of these problems or think about them in cool ways. Like, I'm not an anti-object person either. Like, yeah, but the objects become byproducts.
Well, I think maybe we should open it up. It's great. So I think, first of all, thank you very much for these presentations, and they're very informative and very interesting to me. My question is a little bit teasing out some of the things that you have said, so I apologize if it's a little bit repetitive at first. But thinking about this notion that you are focused on serving or engaging a community that the institution doesn't generally engage, I think that idea that the environment of academia, to which I would extend to the museum institution as well, does often breed that kind of self-reflexivity, and that these projects are often brought in as a way of trying to break out of that. However, my question has to do with the kind of problematics of that and how tokenism may come into play, to put it bluntly. The way that you enter into an institution sometimes to fill a programmatic role of engagement with a community that the institution itself is not taking responsibility for. No matter how long you stay engaged with that institution, has not changed, and how do you resist that co-option? How do you encourage the institution to be transformed by your presence in a longer-term sense? And how might allies of this kind of social engagement, such as, I would say myself, someone who's working as a curator and with a kind of hope of joining academia, to continue to keep these kinds of ideas and practices alive and not encourage the institutionalization that may result. Particularly my concern is when you bring in a great underserved population and they can sort of check off that box and get the fundraising that is attached with reaching that community, and yet the overall programmatics of an institution haven't really shifted. So if you would respond to that, please.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I also think that, a lot of what we've talked about today is perspectives and where you're kind of coming from and which field you're starting, what's your mother tongue and where you're expanding out to. So I mentioned that installation with the dolls I had made, and that being sort of my last still sculpture exhibition. That was with a gallery that I'm no longer working with anymore, that, where the dealer actually told me, your work's really hard to sell. You've got the craft thing, you've got the queer thing, you've got your nerdy research, and, this is not that popular. Collectors don't feel like they need to own this, So, for me, working with museums, especially museum education programs, was this really amazing thing because of the mandate to engage audience and because of the mandate for whatever funding purposes they have, it has allowed me to go into those spaces, those institutions, and have a real dialogue. The whole point is to have a conversation, and so I've been able to work more extensively with a lot of people, more than with curators, actually, in those spaces, and feel like my work is actually making some kind of impact. So I wanted to, kind of put that out there.
I'll give you an example with the Milwaukee Art Museum. Once it became clear that what they were asking me to do is be that black guy, I was like, all right, well, I'm going to start this choir. And then I want you to give 2-year memberships, two 2-year memberships per person in this choir, right? So that you give up 400 pieces of paper. And they were really pissed that I was asking them to do that. And I was like, this is paper. This is gonna, you ain't done, you didn't even spend money because Joyce Foundation gave us the money to have this show. You haven't done it, right? So how can, as part of the artistic practice, we also push past the set of objects that we make to then challenge the museum to do a little bit more. That really, if part of what your goal was, and this is where you start to see what the museum's ambition is. Maybe their goal was to just have them that one time for the black show, and they don't really want to be bothered with black people for the Warhol show, right? But it's how do you, with other populations, create new members that want to be involved and want to stay connected, right? So I'm like, let me help you grow. This is entrepreneurial, baby. This could really help you. And so I had to really help the president of the president of the Milwaukee Art Museum really struggled initially to understand why this had value and why I would be concerned with this kind of thing. And I'm like, well, you don't get half my practice, And so are there other ways that we can, I'm talking about that. Now I work at the University of Chicago, who hasn't always been the best neighbor historically, right? And benefited from urban renewal dollars back in the day to obliterate a fair amount of culture, right? And I'm the black dude, director of arts and public life, new title, fancy, a building in the hood. And what's been interesting is that I've accepted that there was only so much that I could do in my personal practice. I could not dedicate the $2 million that they just dedicated to a 10,000 square foot building. I could not hire somebody at my rate to do the work that I'll do in that 10,000 square feet. And so really what I'm asking is, how can we leverage how can we as creative people leverage all of the resources that we have access to? And instead of owning the label of token, imagine it really as one who's attempting to effectively engage with the resources that we have access to. So I've really taken off the token hat to say, oh, my job here is to help push you into a more direct relationship with your South Side neighbors. Not just the cultural community, because that very easily becomes the downtown civic community. With the Black South Side, I have to say, you know, we have our cultural neighbors and we have our backyard neighbors, and you know, and so it feels like the system didn't change. My perception of myself and my role in the institution shifted to imagine. And what I found is that in these big bureaucratic meetings, if you have the best idea, people will go, oh yeah, it's a really good idea. You know, so then I try to have good ideas. It means you got to read all that stuff, and you know.
It's not exactly the same thing. When I was working with the Public Art Fund on that the large scale muster, I think that, I mean, it started out as like an emerging artist kind of project program that they had called In the Public Realm, and that was, you know, all the artists who preceded me had taken that money and used it to fabricate a sculpture that would go in Central Park or somewhere, or, you know, these different you know, pieces out in the world. And I think when I came along, they were really excited by this idea that, you know, I was actually going to organize all these people, and I was going to get them excited, and I was going to bring in all these people who wouldn't have otherwise had this opportunity. And these are not just artists, they're like accountants and zoologists and, like, you know, scientists and everyday people doing this. And I think for them, they thought they were going to get this really big bang for their buck. And so in that sense, you know, it was kind of working both ways. And one thing that I felt really good about in that project was that I was able to take that budget and pay all of those participants, so that, you know, everybody got a cash bounty. You know, everybody got support to get their stuff picked up and brought on the ferry over there. You know, everybody, you know, felt that they were really being taken seriously, and you know, so it was a platform for people. So, but I think you have to really be on your toes in those, you know, exchanges.
I think we're going to have to, okay, I know you've been waiting, I know.
It's cool.
Okay. Okay, how about if you ask a question, and a couple other people ask your questions, and we can think about them, and take a quick bio break and come back. What was your question?
I just wanted to know the story about the Chinese food restaurant and to see what kind of lasting impact it had, or if they went under or what.
Okay, great. Who else had a question? Anybody else? No? Okay. Okay, great. Expanded ways of thinking around environmentalism, around pedagogy, and again around interdisciplinary art practice. And it's a pleasure to welcome Tamara Roberts to come and kick us off.
I'm Tamara Roberts. I am on the faculty in the music department here. And I am introducing our final panel, Expanding Environmentalism, Expanded Pedagogy. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce our two panelists/panel groups and our respondent for today. First, starting with Marc Bamuthi Joseph. And I'm going to keep the biographies pretty brief so we can get to the presentations and get to discussion too. But there's, as you see, there's more info in the program. First, Marc Bamuthi Joseph, who identifies as a father of Makai, his son, who's in 4th grade, an artist, and you can read a lot more about this work in the program, a teacher and a second-generation American. Just a couple of highlights from the program. He is artistic director of the HBO documentary Arabian Voices, and has a new performance piece that's going to start traveling around, Red, Black, and Green, a Blues. And that looks at eco-equity movement in Black neighborhoods across America. Next we will have, after that, Citizens Lab, and this consists of Amanda Eicher, Jerome Bogg, and Valerie Imus. This is a group that's been working together as the Citizens Laboratory for about a year, and worked together as part of a larger collective, Open Restaurant, for a couple of years together. Each of them also has day jobs, which are no less spectacular. Valerie is also the program manager at Southern Exposure. Amanda is an educator and adjunct professor here. And Jerome is also the head chef at Chez Panisse. So I also want to mention that they'll be serving food at the end of the day, cooked along with one of their community partners from Maisa restaurant in Oakland. And then finally we'll have Kenji Liu, who is a poet and visual artist, responding to them. Also program director at Geneva Car Barn and Powerhouse, which is an organization in Southeast San Francisco that works to develop a central space in the district for artistic and cultural innovation and community engagement, especially of youth in the community. Kenji is also on the board of Kearney Street Workshop. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Hi, I know you're recording, but you're gonna have to follow me because the podium freaks me out a little bit, or more precisely, static energy freaks me out. I'm a dancer. Anybody else dance?
Yes. Yes.
Really? Just yeah, like in your bedroom, you sing in the shower, do you? Okay, half of 1% of us. All right, cool. So, I guess I should just preface whatever it is I'm about to say by saying that I was born in 1975 in New York City. So I was born at the same time and in the same place that hip-hop culture was born. My lens for parenting, for cooking, for making art, and certainly for environment is hip-hop and hip-hop culture. So I want to begin by talking to you about the break. In, I don't know, 1973, this brother named Kool Herc, Jamaican cat, is living in the South Bronx in New York. And he developed this technique whereby he would take two turntables and put the same record on two different turntables. And he noticed that if he waited for the part of a record where all the music was stripped away and there was nothing left but percussion, the dancers went crazy. Dancers would just storm the floor. And that if he could take that one breakdown in the record and extend it, he would also take the dancers that were storming the floor to a different place of ecstasy. He could extend the ecstatic. This is where hip-hop culture ultimately is born. The technique was called the merry-go-round. The technique of extending the breakdown in the record where everything else is stripped away, but the raw root, the thing that activates your limbic cord in a different kind of way. Yeah? By penetrating that aspect of our bodies and our psyches, he could incite a euphoria. The coming together, the collective, the break, the moment of possibility. This is where hip-hop lives. This is how I understand art, intellect, and social practice as only occurring inside the break, only occurring inside the moment of collective possibility when all of the extraneous is stripped away. That being said, I'd like to show you something.
I wrote a play about the process of making Like Is Living happen all over the country. It's called Red, Black, and Green, a Blues. And it premieres at Euro Buena Center. I feel all sheepish, but I'm really proud of what we've done. So please, support. Put your face in the earth when you hit my heart. It'll kill me that every time. Now I'm starting to get me a while. Tap up me, AAL. That's how we get slow. Put your face in the earth. This is for my heart. This is all that you will be. Yo vengo de Panamá. Yo vengo de Panamá. Me puse mis shorts, estoy ribeteado y mi camiseta siempre está bordada. Ya me puse la jumbo, estoy activado.
tierra del canal donde yo fui criado. Yo vengo de Panamá. Panamá, 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 Panamá. Yo vengo de Panamá. Panamá, 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 Panamá. Me nada como Panamá, la tierra del canal se regia en español. Renato y Adornans, de mano de piedra no recae general. El chorrillo verde, el niño pide Colón. El Cristo negro, la feria del fútbol. Los cumbres de mames, saga de mamón. Repito, no hay nada como Panamá. No señor, papi, papá, tell me que eso va. Te invito a que te venga a montar. A mi diablo rojo, di que venga a pasear. Aquí al descentrón, y un baby bar. Chicas hermosas, ella y raca. Fritura los domingos en la casa de mi mamá. Chiche mi golosinas en la de mi abuela. El Rommel Fernández, el niño raca. Hay casas al multi, 100,000 barracas. Yo vengo de Panamá. Yo vengo de Panamá. Me puse mis shorts, estoy rileteado. Y mi camiseta siempre está bordada. Ya me puse la jumbo, estoy activado. La tierra del canal donde yo fui criado. Yo vengo de Panamá. Panamá, Panamá. One more time, please. All those rockers. This is where we at. This is who we are.
What did that? So, what did that have to do with the environment? Anyone? What you just saw. What does that have to do with the environment? Yes, sir.
Environment's not just about greenery, but about your community and surroundings.
Yes. Anyone else?
Animating a public park, is that?
No such thing as a wrong answer. What else? How else?
Bringing life back to the streets.
Yeah. So let's start there. Start with life. About 3.5, about 4, almost 4 years ago, I was sitting in my car with the engine running, drinking Starbucks, and reading about George Bush and how through the Environmental Protection Agency, George W. Bush had essentially struck down a law which would have raised emission standards for automobiles that was first passed in the state of California, but rather than making it a federal statute, he decided to abolish it in California before it spread like a disease, environmental safety, around the country. And one of the very many ironies herein is that as soon as Obama took office, or within 6 months of Obama taking office, that same law became a federal statute. But, I was reading this article and I thought, man, okay, I want to get into the environmental conversation because clearly the President of the United States does not care. And I kind of known that he didn't, but I was shocked to find out that he really, really didn't. So I said, I'm going to get involved, and I'm an artist and I have a platform. People listen to me. And more than that, I'm going to get Black people involved in environment and integrate or intersect Black consciousness and the green movement, because I find that Black folk and poor folk in particular are underrepresented in the green movement. Yeah?
Yeah.
So noble, so middle class, so presumptuous of me. I thought if I did a festival in the middle of the hood and called it a green festival, that kind of by proxy, folks would just respond to this idea and start recycling, I don't know, erect solar panels on Because I had, like many of us I think, and certainly many of my colleagues, I had adopted and co-opted the language and terminology and vocabulary of the green movement and the green sector. And I thought that there was an easy transposition between this kind of glossary of terms that defined environmental health and the practice of environmental consciousness or environmental health in poor and under-resourced communities. So I threw a party. And I had my friend Mos Def perform on a solo-powered stage, and 1,500 people came out. It was on a solo-powered stage. It was really beautiful. It looked a lot like what you just saw. So many people came out, and then the day after, I saw that nothing had changed. You know, the young woman asked earlier a very loaded question about tokenism, and I think essentially what she was talking about was change. How do you work with the institution if you're not going to create or construct institutional change? How do you reconcile that emotionally? And I was really impressed by your responses. But I think it's something that plagues most artists because we come from a place of lack and a place of want. And there's also a certain level of distrust that we have with success. And so how do you co-join with the institution? How do you provoke institutional change and yet maintain your integrity? How do we as individuals provoke institutional change when you know, the behemoth of our government or of our academic environment refuses to move either? So I took this really large question and this lack of a sense of accomplishment and shrunk it a little bit, and kind of self-taught and also worked with others to arrive at a place where I came to understand that the thing that I wanted to address was not green. The place where I wanted to be active, the place where I thought I could actually make a little bit of a difference was in recalibrating and repositioning a collective audience, more around the question of life than around the question of green. I thought that perhaps the pathway to environmental health was to recharge and reignite life as a core individual, collective, and social value. And so I worked with a whole bunch of not-for-profit community activists, do-gooder types, to put this festival on called Life is Living. Through resources attained from the Doris Duke Charitable Fund, we were able to work in Chicago, in Houston, in Harlem, and here in Oakland to reorganize our efforts around green based on an organizing model called the creative ecosystem. The idea of the creative ecosystem works very closely to the idea of critical adjacencies in the retail sector. You take a Safeway and you put it on 51st and Broadway, and it's an attractive place. But you take that same Safeway and you surround it with Payless or Petco or Wells Fargo, and it becomes an even more attractive destination place. In this case, the central value is the amassment of profit. So with the creative ecosystem, what we thought was, well, if we take profit out of the center of our reason for being and our reason for organizing, and we put life at the center of our reason for being, then one, we don't have to transpose our ideals or our understanding of what it means to be environmentally conscious. We can just allow safe space for folks to interpret that same question on their own, and then present it in a frame that includes environmental health. So rather than putting money at the center, we ask at first 4, and then 10, and then 20, and then 30 different individual artists and organizations, what sustains life in your community? And Life is Living, then around the country, becomes their response. Much less than a single day eco-festival, what Life is Living has become is an organizing model by which disparate organizations and entities can come together in response to this question of what sustains life, and then continue to work together in traditional and non-traditional ways. And so what we leave behind, the sustainability model, actually is not so much about conservation or composting or caulking or using ceiling fans or any of these kind of pieces of vocabulary. What it really becomes is a way for disparate organizations to exercise hybridity and diversity in organizing and in practice. Then what we do is document and codify these experiences in such a way that cuts to the heart or cuts to the break. I asked you guys if you dance. I asked you guys about music because I personally don't learn anything unless the content is sweating. If the content isn't bleeding or crying or sweating, I don't really believe it. I love to read and I love to analyze and deconstruct and distill, but my method of teaching is through igniting a sense of personal transformation. And my body is a vessel or a signpost that allows, like a portal, for collective transformation to take place. So when I showed you this this video, that was like his living 2 days ago in Oakland, which is incredible because it was so dope. Man, outside right now, love the rain, you know what I mean? But if it looked like this on Saturday, it would not have, looked like that. We wouldn't have attracted, 5,000 people to the park. What you're seeing now are scenes from Life is Living in Chicago in 2009. And to just kind of further illustrate my point about an emotional entrance or using the break as an entrance towards environmental health. When we first got to Chicago, we thought we were going to impose our ideals into the northern part of the city and locate this eco festival in Clarendon Park on the north side. As we were organizing and working with varied community groups in Chicago, what we learned was folks didn't want to talk about environment. Folks wanted to talk about the 36 school kids that had been murdered that school year. And so as part of our documentation and as part of the codification of this process, we've created a piece called Red, Black, and Green, a blues. And what the piece does is it creates space for the words, the characters, the voices, the ideology of some of these people that we've met all over the country to announce themselves in a theatrical way, in a theatrical form. I bring up the 36 school kids murdered because there's a moment in Red, Black, and Green, and Blues where I ask a mother about environment, she tells me of guns, of emotionally disabled boys whose green movement consists of recycling the sorry narrative of black on black crime. If you brown, you can't go green until you hold a respect for black life. So, the way that all, how much time do I have?
8 minutes.
Sweet. So, the way that all this shows up in my art practice is through a primary collaboration with the director Michael John Garces and the visual artist, sculptor, genius guy, Theaster Gates. Theaster, with his team, has created a set comprised of 100% Chicago garbage, salvaged materials from all over Chicago, and has made these 4 individual homes that replicate the ideals of the 4 cities that we work in, or that we continue to work in with Life is Living. And these 4 individual structures, which all look like different parts of a home, come together to make one shotgun house, emblematic of the shotgun house where I lived in Houston, Texas, while we were researching and making this work. The shotgun house, by the way, was one of Rick Lowe's homes in project row houses. So I talk about, you know, the way that the set is built and the way that the process reflects the product, because this too is a result of and emblematic of a certain kind of environmental consciousness, right? How do you make work that activates a researched performance model that cultivates stories from around the country, gives, I think, a poetic view of ecology, social ecology, and the physical mores of African America, and do it in such a way that it reflects the typical or the conventional vocabulary of the environmental movement? Well, you build a set out of recycled materials. Instead of fluorescent lights, you use LED lights all over it. Instead of generating power or grabbing power from the main grid, you use battery power so that things work at a lower wattage. You know, but then conversely, you fly people from Chicago and Los Angeles and New York to come build the work with you. I talk about this because all the work that we do is complicated by contradiction. And I guess my question is, do you embrace the contradiction and move forward? Do you stop yourself because you don't pass the purity test? Or do you move forward in the hope that somewhere along the way you're going to touch somebody's heart? You're going to make somebody bleed. You yourself are going to spread. And I choose to respond to the question not in a solely academic or intellectual way, although the fire was right there under the chair, but in an emotional way. All those folks that were jumping up and down in that video that I just saw are now more likely to engage in the environmental movement than if they sat at a class here or at Merritt College or at Castlemont High School or really anywhere else. They are primed because there is an emotional channel into the question of environment that I think opens and expands vocabulary in a really significant way. It's something that I've been proud to learn, the deconstruction of myself, moving myself to my own break in search of an environmental question, not quite an environmental answer, but an organizing model that might introduce more folks in, that might invite folks in, that might broaden the points of access, so that this isn't just an intellectual exercise, but it really is something that bleeds and cries and sweats. The result premieres on Thursday.
So Valerie, Jerome, and I are the Citizens Laboratory. We've been working together for about 2 years as part of Open Restaurant, a collective that works with the codes and the architecture of a restaurant as an art space, or as a space for art engagement. But we move the restaurant to different places. So we partner with arts organizations and institutions to do that in different locations. But about a year ago, we started feeling like we wanted to have an outlet that worked a little bit differently, that allowed us to take on civic and public issues, not necessarily about food, and using art institutions, public institutions, as places to work socially, collectively, and civically on these issues. conversation, I actually wanted to ask you to stand up. And here on the page through our website. And I just wanted to throw this image up there. It's a video that we're going to watch in a minute. And it marked this moment where we started to think about what we could do differently in a really concrete way. In January of 2011, this really specific break happened. Not the kind you're talking about maybe, but a break in history where there was a revolution in Egypt, and we felt like that was something that was a break we wanted to jump into. That was a split in time that was possibly one of the most important ones in our own personal history. So I wanted to ask you to just think about where you were at that moment. To do that thing that our parents do or that our grandparents do, to say, you know, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? Where were you when Martin Luther King died? What happened when you heard about Pearl Harbor? All those things that we hear people saying. What happened to us when that revolution was happening? And who told you? Who was around? What was going on at that moment? Just wanted to think about that for a second. And do you have it in your mind? And just play this video. Hey, play this video.